Greetings all, Chieftain here. I have been asked to rabbit on a little bit about the battleship Alabama, and in order to tell its story, well, we probably need to start with the design process and the predecessor class, North Carolinas. Now, impressive though the North Carolinas may have seemed, they never really made everybody happy. Probably the biggest concern was the relative lack of armor protection. Now, there's always going to be a trade-off in ship armor design. Actually, many. But the first thing to understand is the basic required effect. So, for example, those of us coming from the tank world would have to understand that what is more important than being able to protect against a certain type of shell is what's known as the zone of immunity. And that is the idea that a ship is fairly well protected against a likely enemy no closer than a certain distance and no further away than a certain distance. In other words, it's something of a concentric ring around the opposing ship. Ideally, you want your ship to be in a zone of immunity against the enemy ship, whilst at the same time being the correct distance away so that you are outside of the enemy's zone of immunity against you. If you can manage this, then, in theory, you can batter the enemy into submission whilst taking only superficial damage yourself. It comes down to the arc of flight over the long distances involved in naval combat. It is no longer reasonable to assume that there is a likely angle of impact against which to protect. So the designers did their best to armor both deck and belt armor in order to make the most effective use of the weight capacity that they had available to them. Belt armor is simple enough. The shell is going to impact near enough to horizontal when at short range. The thicker the armor, the better. But eventually, the range will be so close that the impacting shell will have retained sufficient velocity to punch through anyway. Now, there are two ways to improve protection here. Simply make the belt thicker, or give it some angle. Making the belt thicker adds weight. Angling the armor will result in less protected volume for the weight, because part of the cross-section will be outside of the belt. At any rate, the relationship between the belt armor and the impacting round will give you the minimum radius of this zone of immunity. The outer radius is determined by the deck armor. The further a round travels, the closer to vertical the round will be, falling as it impacts. Thus, if properly designed, at distances where the impacts are starting to become more likely to be on the deck than on the belt, the deck will be thick enough to take the impacted round at that shallow dive angle. Eventually, of course, as the rounds start falling more vertically at the longer ranges, that level of armor will be defeated. When you get to the distance at which it becomes impossible to add more deck armor, due to the weight mainly, you have just reached the outer level of your zone of immunity. Thickening is the only option for two reasons. Well, firstly, it's a deck and you need it to be flat for people to walk on without falling over. And secondly, angling is likely to simply provide a more perpendicular target for most rounds. This brings us back to the North Carolinas. These ships had a higher speed and greater firepower than most other battleships of the era, but the problem was armor protection. North Carolina was rated to provide a good zone of immunity against 14-inch shells, somewhere on the order of between 20,000 and 29,000 yards. This would be fine against the majority of opposition, but it was noted that against her own guns, the immunity zone was estimated as only some 2,800 yards wide for the machinery, starting at about 23,000 yards, and 6,500 yards wide over the magazines, starting at about 21,000. This was before the Bureau of Ordnance invented a new, heavier 16-inch projectile, which was actually end up being carried by the US ships. Against an enemy battleship with guns that imposing, those narrow zones of immunity would become even narrower, if not eliminated entirely. Thus it was that for the next class of ship, the South Dakotas, a little greater attention was given to armor protection against 16-inch shells. The problem was that fundamentally this meant thicker armor. This in turn led to a few more problems for the designers to solve. For starters, the US still intended to keep within the limits of the London Treaty. This meant a maximum displacement of 35,000 tons. Of course, the North Carolinas weren't far from this tonnage either. So the question became, how does one create a ship with thicker armor whilst retaining the same displacement? The solution? Make it smaller and more compact. As a result, the South Dakotas were almost 10% shorter than the North Carolinas that preceded them. This resulted in a new set of problems for the designers to solve. First, of course, was getting the most efficient design for the armor. The belt angle was made steeper and set deeper inside the ship. The phenomenon of shells turning horizontally upon impact in the water, something that the Japanese Navy had noticed, had also been noticed by the US Navy. The US didn't go to the same extent as the Japanese of creating rounds specifically to exploit this effect, but the threat was still there. As a result, underwater protection was necessary. For an example as to what could happen in the case of such a hit, see the exploits of USS Boise, which suffered serious damage from a turned underwater shell. Now granted, this was still an extremely rare fluke, but a battleship is a pretty expensive piece of hardware to lose just due to a golden BB. The next problem was speed. As a general rule, the better the length to beam ratio of a ship, the faster it will go for the same power. However, the ship had just been made shorter, which was the first issue. The second issue was that if you were making a ship displace the same amount of water, say 35,000 tons, and you have reduced the length, that volume of water has to come from somewhere. The ship couldn't be made any wider, as it still had to pass through the Panama Canal, so that displacement had to be moved to the third axis, depth. As a result, the South Dakotas would draw several feet more than their predecessors. You can see how there would be a snowball effect happening here. The deeper draft meant that you were talking about greater water resistance. The water pressure, of course, is greater lower down, which makes it harder for the ship to move that same amount of water out of the way. And there was the minor detail that a lot of the harbors that the US Navy used weren't rated for ships of the designed 35-foot draft. The dry docks at Pearl Harbor and New York, for example, had less than 33 feet of clearance. This is where adherence to the 35,000-ton limit started to become mostly just an exercise in legalese. For example, in order to keep the official weight down, the standard ammunition capacity of the magazines was set at 675 rounds, at just shy of 1.5 tons apiece. However, they made sure to leave space for a mobilization supply of an additional 495 rounds. Similarly, they didn't really need to keep the drinking water tanks filled all the way all the time, so you could save 100 tons there. Or maybe you could carry not quite as many tons of lubricating oil, and perhaps only a month's worth of food instead of 3. And do we really need to carry a full ton of paint in standard configuration? By the use of these little tricks, the displacement limit could be basically adhered to. The ships were still officially a few hundred tons overweight, but it wasn't a bad effort. However, one cannot fudge physics the same way as one can fudge a contract. Mobilization only supply or not, if the ship was going to carry an additional 800 tons of ammunition in the warfighting configuration, she was going to sit lower in the water. When Massachusetts went through the Panama Canal in 1943, the officially 35-foot draft ship cleared the 41.5-foot docks with just less than 1.5 yards under the keel. Of course, the realities were not lost on the US Navy. They knew very well that the ships were coming into the real world at some 44,000 tons, so there were no horrible accidents resulting from, for example, trying to put the 37-foot deep ship into Puget Sound's 35-foot dry dock. With the ship sitting so low in the water, there wasn't a whole lot of freeboard, and they were quite wet. Indeed, so much so that the forward Aa gun mount proved to be all but pointless, the gun crew fighting the water more than the enemy. It was later removed to save weight. Still, the draft required power to, power through and keep speed up. The solution was to install more powerful machinery into smaller machinery spaces. The way it was done was to no longer separate out boiler rooms and engine rooms, as much as to simply stagger the things with shafts running under other machinery. Add a few other tweaks to the generation system and voila! 135,000 shaft horsepower in less space than 115,000 up in North Carolina. As a result, the Sodaks were not going to be as slow as originally feared. A look at the stern of the ship will also reveal her to be more of a novel wedge shape underwater than the more typical point. Design innovation aside, there was no getting around the fact that the ship was cramped. They were stuffing a whole heck of a lot of ship and firepower into only 680 feet. Things only got worse as the anti-aircraft weapon suite was continually increased, as was the need for living space for the crews to man those guns. The original Aaa Battery was 3 Chicago pianos and 12 caliber 50s. And obviously this was not going to cut it, and by the time Alabama, which in fairness had the pianos replaced by Bofors even before she was built, was done with the war, she was carrying some 12 quad 40s out of a planned 18 and 56 Oerlikon 20s. What was originally a ship designed for 1,849 men ended up having to accommodate some 2,350. The catwalks you can see on the sides are simply because the superstructure was too wide to otherwise allow access to the fuel ports. The final notable but not oft noted addition was that of the radars. Originally she had an air search and a surface search radar plus 2 main battery fire control radars, and additionally 4 for the secondary battery. Backups were added after South Dakota's encounter with the Kirishima group in 1942, which saw her radars blown away. The details of that engagement are probably best left for a more thorough video on the Guadalcanal actions, but the bottom line is that Sodak came out a little bit worse for wear for the exchange. Now she took only a mild battering from 14, 8 and 5-inch shell fire, but was, at least for the duration of the fighting, something of a mission kill. In a night action and reduced to local control, matters were made worse when the shock of the No. 3 turret firing caused electrical trouble, and then the blast from the main battery also destroyed their own catapult aircraft, although perhaps that wasn't so much of a concern at night. Kirishima was put down fairly quickly by Washington, so it became merely a matter of conjecture as to how well South Dakota might have come out in an extended engagement. But the upshot was that given that the ship was designed to resist 16-inch shells, it would have taken quite a sustained 14-inch barrage to finally threaten a ship, no matter the carnage that was happening outside the Citadel. And doubtless the US Navy's damage control teams would have figured out some sort of a solution in the meantime. And it's not as if South Dakota stopped firing entirely anyway, but that was the only significant surface action by a South Dakota class, so like many of the last generations of battleships, they were never really truly able to show what they could do. Now, this video of course is entitled Alabama, so let's get to her. She was launched from the Norfolk Navy Yard 16th February 1942, 2 years and 2 weeks after her keel was laid, commissioned 16th of August 1942 under the brief command of Captain George B. Wilson. Once the shakedown cruise was completed, handed over to Captain Fred D. Kirkland, she was placed in company of South Dakota, newly repaired and refitted from her Solomon's excursion, sent to Scapa Flow, and the 2 ships became the most powerful battleships in the British home fleet. The British immediately put her to use, first crossing the Arctic Circle in the operation to reinforce Spitsbergen, and then participating in Operation Governor, which was partially a distraction against operations in Sicily, and also an attempt to see if the Germans would send Tirpitz out to play. Well, this did not happen, so the British sent her home in August of 1943 without any battle scars to her credit. She didn't stop long. She hung around long enough to receive a new air search radar, and off she went again. No, just receive it, it was still in the crate. She crossed into the Pacific for the first time on the 25th of August 1943, and finally earned her first battle star in Operation Galvanic, the attack on the Gilbert Islands. She supported the landings on Tarawa, and then Betio and Macon. During this operation she had her first engagement against enemy aircraft, and then came Nauru, where she fired off 535 rounds, and presumably raised her draft a little. Around this time, that new radar got mounted on the ship by way of a makeshift slide rig created by the crew during some downtime in the South Pacific. A very brief dry docking at Pearl Harbor saw her outboard port screw replaced, and then it was right back into the fray only a few days later to the Marshall Islands, again in company of South Dakota, Battlestar No. 2. A few hundred rounds later, saw the destruction of quite a few enemy assets, including her first airplane kills, although they were admittedly on the ground at the time. Her first flying kill was a Betty at the end of March. Battlestar No. 3 came with the Asiatic Pacific raids of mid-February to early April 1944. It was actually a fairly quiet time for her, mainly escorting Yorktown and occasionally popping off shots at the odd Japanese aircraft that strayed within range. However, in this period came Alabama's only combat fatalities. 5 men were killed when the No. 9 5-inch mount was accidentally fired into the No. 5 mount during fighting to drive off aircraft. Trading Yorktown for Enterprise, Battlestar No. 4 was awarded for keeping the carrier company as the US attacked New Guinea, including at Hollandia, Etape, and Humboldt Bay. Truk received some 16-inch attention as well at the end of this period, followed by a, quote, leisurely bombardment of Panap. The Marianas Operation Forger was the occasion of her 5th Battlestar. Alabama took part in the 7-hour shelling of Saipan on the 13th of June, but more importantly was involved in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, aka the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, in which she was the first to report the approach of the enemy, courtesy of that shiny new radar. A number more aircraft were shot down, and South Dakota took minor damage from a bomb. Next came Guam with Bunker Hill, and then a layover in Eniwetok, where Captain Kirtland departed and Captain Vincent Murphy came aboard for a rather short stint in command. Battlestar No. 6 was the Western Caroline Islands, most of September with CV-9, Essex, and later other carriers, where Alabama served as part of their screening force. People on Yap and southern Palau may have been able to see her. Next, Leyte and Battlestar 7, the middle of October, again protecting US carriers. Sadly, she was in the wrong place for Leyte Gulf, being part of Halsey's detachment, and so missed the excitement of both Taffy 3 and Surigao Strait. It was more carrier escort for the rest of the year, really, particularly around Luzon, although there was the stress of riding out Typhoon Cobra, which destroyed her aircraft. Still, she fared better than some of the other ships in the fleet. 3 destroyers were sunk. At this point, it was time to return to Bremerton, Washington for a thorough overhaul. With this also came a new skipper. Captain William B. Goggins came aboard at Pearl Harbor to learn the ropes and took over in Washington. As the XO of USS Marblehead, he had suffered severe burns in the Battle of the Java Sea, and then he had to evade the Japanese and escape to Australia aboard small craft when the Japanese landed on Java. But since October of '42, he had been the officer in charge of the Pacific Fleet's Radio Intelligence Unit in Pearl Harbor. It was early May before Alabama was back in the battle area, with the invasion of Okinawa earning her her 8th Battlestar. She fought the weather as much as the enemy. Another storm, Typhoon Connie, took another shot at 3rd Fleet, but damage was more limited. The cruiser Pittsburgh lost her bow, but no ships were sunk this time. At least 2 more enemy aircraft were added to Alabama's tally. The 9th and last Battlestar was for operations against the Japanese home islands. She shelled Hitachi Mito, a little north of Tokyo, on the 17th of July in darkness, but by this point active opposition to US forces was dwindling. Once the war ended, Alabama transported some 700 men of a CB battalion, somehow, back to the US. She hung around California until early February 1946, now under the command of Captain E.H. Pierce, formerly skipper of USS Gleaves, when she went up to Bremerton, Washington for inactivation. She was placed in reserve 9th of January 1947 and struck from the register on the 1st of June 1962. Only 2 years later, she was transferred to her home state, then towed through the Panama Canal for only the 2nd time in her life, arriving September of 1964. She has been a public museum ship in Mobile Bay ever since and remains there still. As for the captains, was the Lucky A truly lucky for them? Captain George B. Wilson ended up as a Rear Admiral assigned to the US military attaché to the United Kingdom by 1945. He was retired by 1947, at which point he was identified as a member of a supposedly secret Naval Academy society known as the Green Bowlers, which achieved some press as being identified, and subsequently absolved, of being a system for the advancement of its members for plush assignments. He died December 1949 and is buried in Arlington. Fred Kirtland, from that proud seafaring state of Kansas, found himself ashore setting up Naval Operations Base in Okinawa, and after the war became commander of amphibious training for the Atlantic Fleet. And then as Vice Admiral, the Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Logistics. He made it to age 79, dying in 1972 in Queens, New York. Captain Vincent Murphy also made it to Rear Admiral, curiously also ending up on the staff of the Chief of Naval Operations for Logistics. He retired from the Navy in 1946 and went on to be the Executive Vice President of the Navy Relief Society, retiring from that in 1962. He died in 1974, age 78. Captain William Goggins also made it to Rear Admiral. After handing off command of Alabama, he too served in the office of the Chief of Naval Operations before returning to the intelligence business in 1947 for a few months, heading the Naval Administrative Command of the Central Intelligence Group. From there he went on to be the Chief of Staff to the Commandant in Balboa in the Canal Zone, before retiring in 1949 and working as a researcher for John Hopkins. And then he set up his own computer and communications company, General Kinetics, not related to the current company of the same name. He died in 1985. As for Captain Pierce, well, I have to say I haven't been able to find out much more about him. And, well, that's the story of Alabama and her 9 battle stars. Hope you found it interesting. I'll see you on the next one.